Thanks, Kim. And as she mentioned, I am one of the hosts of APTN National News. My pleasure to act as your moderator for tonight's Assembly of First Nations National Chief Candidates Forum here at the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. Just a quick recognition of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs Grand Chief, Arlen Dumas, who will have come up in a moment to provide some remarks. Congrats to AMC on the 30th annual AGA. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge Chief Deborah Smith, who I believe is out there, for hosting us here on our homeland of Broken Head Ojibwe First Nation on Treaty 1 territory. Thank you, Chief Smith. And a thanks to the candidates for joining us. I do have to point out one candidate, Russ Diabo, was unable to attend tonight and sends his regrets as he has a family emergency that he had to attend to. And we will get right into the candidates forum right away, but first I'd like to welcome up here AMC Grand Chief Arlen Dumas to provide a couple of quick remarks.
Good evening, everyone. Chiefs, again, it's nice to see how well attended our assembly is. I'm glad that we're able to stay together, and I know that you have many, many other demands, but I'm grateful of all of you for dedicating this time to be a part of our assembly, but also staying here to be a part of the candidates debate. I wanted to thank those chiefs that had asked or made the request to see if we could actually have the candidates come and join us here in Manitoba at this time so that we could share some words with them. I'm looking forward to hearing the questions and the conversations, and I'm looking forward to how the dialogue is going to move forward. I wanted to welcome our guests. I haven't had a chance to shake their hands, but I will as the evening goes on. But welcome to Manitoba. Welcome to our territory. Welcome to our home. And I'm looking forward to listening to the dialogue. So, Igo se nas komit na tagutig. Igo se.
We had 51 chiefs.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Thank you, Grand Chief. If we could have the four candidates come up here and join us, maybe to my right, and we'll start off with providing each of the candidates with 3 minutes to just tell us a little bit about themselves. Sure, yeah.
Thank you very much for your words. You're welcome.
Mm-hmm. Right in front of me. No.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Sorry. Can I ask my staff to come and clear off the table a little bit here, please, if you wouldn't mind? And that and to the staff, if some of you actually, I know you're busy and we have a lot of other things we need to prepare for. So those of you who don't necessarily have to be here right now, you're excused for the evening. I know that there's other things you have to prepare for, but you're more than welcome to stay as well, staff, if you want. Thank you. And with that said, Chiefs, let's give our staff a round of applause. They work very hard for us, so I want to acknowledge each and every one of them.
Big thanks to all the staff here. So in just a second, we'll start with the candidates. We'll all be provided with 3 minutes. And Catherine, perhaps we'll start with you on the end and make our way this way. Sorry? Yeah, we can just provide the mic there a little better. And so starting off will be Catherine Whitecloud.
I'm not taking direction from you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Hamitakipi, my relatives, I greet all of you with a very happy heart. And our Creator has given us a beautiful day today to live and to do the best that we can on this day. We've been given 3 minutes, and so I'm going to talk as fast as I can. But before I do that, I want to thank the elders for their direction and for their prayers this morning and for the songs and for the water ceremony. And thank you to Chief Smith and her community for inviting us here. And thank you, Grand Chief, for the welcoming remarks, and to all of you who have welcomed us. In introducing myself, I feel like I'm regurgitating because I've stood at this podium many, many times and chaired your assemblies for you. And so I'm not going to get too much into that other than I'm Catherine Whitecloud, actually Hapa Machbiaska from Wipazoka Wakpa Oyate of the Machbiaska Tioshpaya. And I know you all understand that. So I'm going to talk about why I'm here and what it's for. And I read a comment made by a leader who wrote on a post this morning when he talked about vision, and that a nation without vision will perish. And that really gave me thought, because I've talked to him many times. And I also spoke with him about our youth, and that was discussed this morning in the context of drug abuse and the challenges our children have, and our children in care, and the fact that our young people don't have access to post-secondary funding and post-secondary education as they should. And also the fact that our languages are languishing, and that our languages, which provide us with the foundation for who we are, our connection to the land, and everything that we're about, we need to make that a foundation for everything that we do. Because when we talk about nationhood, and I hear that a lot, in the context of all of the work that is being done nationally and the work that you're doing, nationhood involves land, it involves language, it involves who we are as a people. We have to remember that. We also have to remember that we need our children to have a future. And without them, we're nothing. Ask a mother who's lost a child. Ask a single father who's lost his only son. Ask a grandmother that's still crying for their grandchild that hasn't come home. And you will understand how important children are to our future, and the fact that without them, we are nothing. I am nothing without my children and my grandchildren. And we have to make that the center of everything we do, and the center of the whole path that we're moving forward on together. Everything that happens here today is much beyond the convention floor. It does not end here, and it does not end in Vancouver. Many of us have been walking this path for a long, long time. And tell me honestly, how has life improved for your child since the middle 60s, when things started changing, and we saw that video this morning? How has life changed? What have we done to affect change, and what are we going to do going forward? How are you going to exercise your right as a nation? How are you going to show people what are you going to do to be a nation? Are you going to promote your languages and protect them? Protect your children. Protect your way of governance. Protect how you do business with each other. And, I'm really beginning to dislike you.
Sorry, I can't...
And I don't even know you that well, but my platform is about nationhood and what we're going to do, protect it and move forward, and it's got to be about children. Wopira, mitake was.
And thank you, Catherine. Next up, we'll have Perry Bellegarde.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just very quickly to acknowledge Chief Deborah Smith here at Broken Head, and as well Grand Chief Arlen Dumas and Chief Sheila North, Grand Chief Sheila North, and Chief Jerry Daniels as well, and Regional Chief Kevin Hart. All the chiefs here. Homatake apipinama, washtekona. As well, ninashkamun, kanaskum tenwak, kio kiteyak, okimawak, notawin and smanito kanaskumtin. Just a little bit in Cree, and we have 3 minutes, so just to acknowledge the leadership that's here, acknowledging the elders. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm from a small reserve called Little Black Bear First Nation, Treaty 4 territory. And this 3 minutes we have it's all about something we need to do collectively together. And I always carry this treaty medallion with me when we come to treaty territories, because this is all about land and resources. And this treaty relationships with the Crown, high up. Treaty will always trump policy no matter what we do. And this darn Indian Act's been in place since 1876. And that's what we got to move beyond. And start exerting inherent rights, our own First Nations laws, our own First Nations sovereignty, our own First Nations jurisdiction. Because as Indigenous peoples, the most important right we have is the right to self-determination as nations. And that right to self-determination is based on 5 things. Our own languages, our own lands, our own laws, our own people, our own identifiable forms of government. And that's what we have to get back to. Because when you start talking about lands and resources, that starts to close the gap. Because in Canada, we still have poverty amongst our people. It's 6th versus 63rd. So when I became national chief 4 years ago, I said, we got to close this gap. Because this gap represents everything we complain about every day, from the overcrowded housing, to the high youth suicide rate, to the 40,000 children in care, too many of our people in jails. The list will go on and on. And so we need to get resources out to you as chiefs, out to the communities, to close the gap in education, healthcare, justice, housing, child welfare. The list will go on and on. And as an Assembly of First Nations, we're to work as a team. You have an election tomorrow for regional chief. They bring your issues, concerns to our national table. We have to work collectively in that environment as a team. We're an advocacy organization. Our most important job is to open the door, then get out of the way. Get out of the way for chiefs and the nations to come in. That's our job, nationally. And we also take this fight, we say, to close this gap to the international arena as well, within the United Nations. And that's something we have to keep pushing forward. But to me, as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grass grows, peaceful coexistence and mutual respect between First Nations people and the white people, the non-Indigenous peoples that came here to these lands. And we have to share in the land and resource wealth. We have to. That's how we're going to bring things back. We don't need to get our monies from the backs of the Canadian taxpayers. It's just the land and resource wealth. So when we start talking about a new fiscal relationship with the Crown, that's part of that work going forward. And we open doors not only with Liberals, but Conservatives, NDP, all of them. So hopefully in next week, another mandate, another term. Keep the consistency, continuity. Let's keep our circle strong. Here goes it.
Thank you, Perry. Sheila North, if you wouldn't mind coming up.
Entonces, Sheila dislingas on ban bonimig ni no se megods kitumakan Manitoba QA tanaw yo kimakana kiratamis katanaw gakino gamina mantu ninaskamagi toma be rutahegwakanost. I want to greet you all and thank you all for having us here, especially in the Treaty 1 territory in the Broken Head Ojibwe Nation, and greet all of my fellow chiefs, Grand Chief Arlen Dumas for having your AGA, and of course my good friend Jerry Daniels from the SCO organization, and all of you Northern and Central and Southern chiefs, and of course my colleagues. I welcome Miles to this territory and Perry as well, and of course Catherine. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about why I ended up deciding to run as National Chief. When I became a Grand Chief of MKO 3 years ago, I was asked by our people and our chiefs to run. It wasn't my intention to run, but I realize now, having done this work and learning what I've learned, it was all meant to be from the very beginning. My late father, who passed away a few months ago, he taught me the very earliest memory I have as a child is Elijah Harper coming to our house and talking about politics. And ever since that moment, politics has been around my life, my entire life. And my father has trained me. He was part of the MIB and the NIB, and he worked with a lot of our people that have set the stages for where we are right now. So that's the ultimate reason. I feel like one of our elders has told me when I decided to run as MKO, she told me that not to take this being asked to run as a compliment, but an obligation. And I take that as an obligation right now, and I've been asked to run for National Chief as well by chiefs across the country, starting in BC, in Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And I'm very humbled and honored that I'm in this position to be asked for that. But I give the credit to our Northern Manitoba chiefs and our Southern chiefs for helping me to get to this platform, because without you and your direction and your guidance and the work that we did together this last 3 years, I know that this is not where I would be. And I know that there's been a lot of work done and a lot of work that needs to be done. And I want to move with our national organization and move with our neighbors across this country who are seeking for a stronger sovereign voice. And that's what I want to support, is your sovereignty and your nations, because you have the ideas, you know what the solutions are, and that's what I stand to support going forward nationally. There's diversity across this country. In BC, Ontario, in the Yukon, there's differences, but there are also great unifiers, that we all have things in common, that we care about our children and our lands and our resources. So while there is a lot of diversity, there is a lot of good unity that we have yet to achieve, and that's what I want to fight for. So thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. And last but not least, Miles Richardson.
Thank you, moderator. I am Miles Richardson. I am Kilslai Kaji Sting. I'm from the Eagle clan of Joth of the Haida Nation. I want to greet you, Haida Las, good people, Singay La. I'm really happy to share a part of this beautiful day with you. I want to thank the Grand Chief, Arlen Dumas, for the welcome, and Chief Deborah Smith and the Broken-Head Ojibwe Nation for welcoming us into your territory, into this Treaty 1 territory. I'm here this afternoon to ask you for your support in my bid for National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. I'm here to ask for your vote, and I know that means I'm asking for your trust. And I want to tell you that I'm running for National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations for one very clear reason, that it's past time that we change our relationship with Canada as Indigenous peoples. That in changing our relationship with Canada, the first thing that we need to do is to build strong nation-to-nation relationships amongst ourselves as Indigenous people, as Indigenous nations. Once we do that, we sit down with the Crown and establish proper nation-to-nation relationships with the Crown and Right of Canada. We need to stand up and be who we are as nations to enable that. If we wait any longer, it's not going to happen. We are all the people of our territories. Each of our nations, the Haida Nation, the Cree Nation, each of you in Treaty 1 are the people of your territories. Before Canada came here, our nations flourished. Our nations will flourish again. We need to stand up together and assert our treaty rights, our Aboriginal rights and title, and move forward together. We need to stand up with determination together. In the meantime, we invest in closing the social gaps. Why should our people have to fight for clean water? Why should we have to have fancy negotiations to protect our women and girls? Why should we have to have fancy negotiations to protect our languages? That's a Crown obligation. Let's stand up together and insist on that. This is our country. These are our lands. And I'm asking each of you to send a message across to the nations across this country, to the people of Canada and the governments of Canada, that it's time we fix this. Vote for Miles Richardson for National Chief. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Miles. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs has provided 3 questions that each candidate will get 3 minutes to respond to, and then we'll be opening it up to the floor. The first question, Miles, do you mind if we start on your end and work our way down? As National Chief, if your office continues to work on joint priorities with Canada, how will you work to ensure that your office is supporting First Nations in Manitoba to uphold our enduring relationships established through treaty and self-government agreements, and support the capacity of our First Nations governments and citizens to advance their self-sufficiency?
How long for that?
3 minutes.
3 minutes?
Yes.
Thank you for the question. I think that is a key question, if not the key question. Let's start off by recognizing, first of all, that the Assembly of First Nations is not a government. It's not the government of the First Nations in this country, and shouldn't act as a government when we're standing up and asserting our rights. The Assembly of First Nations and the National Chief has an important leadership role to play in identifying what we share in common, the issues, the values, the principles, the objectives we as nations share in common, and in pulling us together and creating a united front, because that's our strongest political leverage in dealing with Canada. As National Chief, I would stand up with you in Treaty 1 in all the treaty nations across this country and remind Canada that until this country honors its existing treaties, there's no point in negotiating new ones. There's no point in pretending we're going forward and addressing rights and title, addressing the human rights of Indigenous people. We need to begin by addressing treaties. As National Chief, I would sit down with you. I'd listen to what your issues are, what your concerns are. I've heard those clearly today. The Natural Resources Transfer Agreement was done. It was done in the face of your treaties, with your treaties existing, turning the subject, the assets of our treaty rights, of your treaty rights, of our Aboriginal rights over to the provinces, oppressing you, pushing you down, pushing you out of the way, taking your treaty rights and handing them to somebody else. We need to stand up right now. We need to use the winning streak of court victories that our people have won over the past years. We need to use international standards like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which sets a standard for equality of governments in this country. Indigenous people are at the same level, not one bit inferior to Crown governments, federal or provincial. We need to sit down and talk about sharing the wealth on that basis. Never should discussion of our treaty rights, our rights and title happen without us being a full recognized partner in the room, and they'll never get away with that while I'm your National Chief. Thank you.
Sheila, if you wanted to come up, or we can move the mic, either way.
Thank you very much. Very good question, and I have to say that the voices coming from the voices that I've worked with, the chiefs and the councillors these past 3 years, have always reminded me that our treaties are paramount to our relationship with each other and with the governments, and that's what it's all about. These joint priorities committees that are created in Ottawa, that are being talked about, that discuss our lives and our lands, is not representative of the voices coming from our nations. And we heard a little tiny bit of that voice, and we need to hear it more. For example, when Chief Merrick talked about Manitoba Hydro and taking that sign off, it was a real offense to her, because she knows what the impact industry has had on her people, and that's what it's all about. All of you have concerns like that, and I know that from your territories that you want to assume your own sovereignty and that you want to be self-sufficient, and that's what the national organization should be doing as a National Chief, to come and stand with you to fight for that self-determination and self-sufficiency, and that's what I want to stand with you. There's been many voices across this country that are also feeling the same thing. I feel like that this country, this Canada, the Canadian government, is starting to get a grasp that our sovereignty voices are getting stronger and stronger, and they're trying to contain it by introducing these new legislation and in this joint committee to try and contain us. But I don't believe it can contain us anymore. A chief in Alberta told me, and he told me to remember this, and I always remember it. He says, remember, 150 years ago, we were meant to be extinct. And 150 years later, today, we're in every facet of society. When you look at health, when you look at justice, when you look at even the media, and when you look at health, we're in everything. And we're going to take everything back the way that our people need. Because the truth of the matter is, when we look at the health of our people, and especially in northern Manitoba, we have some of the most poorest health conditions and housing. There is so much work to do, and those plans and programs were designed by governments that are not working for us. So that, to me, is where I would push committees that will let our voices come further and closer to the front, so we can determine our own way. It's no longer possible to let this government tell us what to do. Everything that they decide should never be about us without us, and I stand with you on that, because that's what you've taught me to stand up for these last 3 years, and I will continue to do that as your National Chief. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. Perry, would you...
Again, the question to work on priorities from the Manitoba territory and region. And one of the things, again, as National Chief, you're one person, but you work as a team with 10 regional chiefs. And your regional chief is to listen to each and every one of the chiefs here to bring things to our quarterly executive meetings. We have 2-day executive meetings now. 1 day management and operations, 2nd day all politics, bringing in the ministers, bringing the Prime Minister's office, bringing Privy Council office, bringing Treasury Board, bringing finance. So that's what we've set up. So you have to work as a team. You don't work in isolation as an individual. It doesn't work that way at our Assembly of First Nations. And so some of the things that we've got to move beyond now, and we've talked about fixing these 4 policies that are outdated and based on termination of rights and title. There's 4 very key policies we have to fix because they affect everybody. That's comprehensive claims, specific claims, additions to reserve, the inherent right to self-government are 4 policies currently based on termination of rights and title, not recognition of rights and title. So we've got to put the proper systems in place to fix that. The other thing, those things, those 4 policies, don't respect treaties. And we always said, I tell chiefs to use these words: assumed Crown sovereignty, assumed Crown jurisdiction, because we don't believe our reservations are federal Crown land set aside for the use and benefit of Indians. It's sovereign territory, sovereign land. And we got to start rebuilding that self-determination and jurisdiction to go beyond our reservations throughout our ancestral lands, throughout our treaty territories. So that's the one piece on those policies that have to be fixed. That's one piece. Then when we got into office, we said, you know, these contribution agreements just don't work for Indian people. The FSO comes out it used to be January, February, sign these, chiefs, or you don't get any money April 1. That's what they used to do. And we said, that's not right, that's not really treaty implementation, it's not doing anything in 2018. So we said, we got to have a better fiscal relationship with the Crown. All 634 First Nations benefit when you have a better fiscal relationship with the Crown. And so we're starting to work on that because we want a new fiscal agreement based on 4 things. Total population, on and off the reserve. Keep up with inflation, consumer price indexing, based on treaty-based funding. But more importantly, a percentage of land and resource wealth. That's the task and work going forward. So these contribution agreements just don't cut it. You want a nation-to-nation transfer between governments. And that's the work we're doing at our Chiefs Committee on Fiscal. That's the work we have to continue so that we make a change. And so we have those resources coming out to you, the chiefs, and your people. The other point, when we say... 17 seconds. Okay. The next point, when we do the legislation, that's one piece. We also have to work on this justice system. We saw what happened in Tina Fontaine. We saw what happened with John Stiers and Colton Bushy. We need to move to a restorative justice system, not a punitive justice system. And that's the work we have to go ongoing. So, that's the time ran out. I can have more, but that's it.
Thanks, Perry. Catherine?
Thank you. I'm going to refer directly to the question that was posed to us, which is about the relationship between Canada and our people. And what does that mean for us, and what are we going to do about it? The fiscal legislative agenda is fast-moving, provides us with little time to dialogue and strategically plan by our nations and with our nations. It's being dictated to us, and we don't have a say in how it's going to proceed. It's very strategically, only certain people are invited to those meetings. I know some of you have received those invitations to attend those meetings. Now, what does that mean? Why is it like that? Why are only certain people invited to the meetings? And when we talk about treaty relationships, and I know it's been said before in this forum, that we as Dakota people do not have treaty. We certainly do. We have every kind of treaty with all of you. In the traditional treaties that were arranged with our people and with your people, before there was ever written treaty on paper. And everyone needs to learn and understand what those are about, our relationships with each other. And also when it comes to governance, it is your right to determine how you want to govern your people, because you already have those laws in your language, and you already have those understandings within your traditional knowledge that your elders and your knowledge holders hold. And those are the forms of governance that you need to be talking about. And when it comes to fiscal relationships, when we have a population that is the fastest growing population in Canada, which is growing 4 times the national rate, how can we arrange and talk about a fiscal arrangement that is still only talking about lifting a 2% cap that's been in place for 22 years? How are we ever going to catch up with the fact that our population is growing 4 times faster in a span of 10 years? How are we going to address that? That is entirely up to you, the nation, to determine that with the support of your regional organizations and your national organizations. We're here to create the space for you so that work that you need to do as a nation can be done, not to do it without your involvement. It's your people, it's your land, and it's your children. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Our next question is about children, and in Manitoba we have roughly 11,000 children in a child welfare system, with 90% of those children being Indigenous. First Nations in Manitoba are working to restore the inherent right for jurisdiction over their children and families in Manitoba. In your role as National Chief, how would you support this? Miles, do you mind starting again?
Again, thank you, moderator. That's a good question. It gets right to the point, I believe. If, as National Chief, I would stand with the First Nations in Manitoba in taking over, assuming jurisdiction, your jurisdiction, over the well-being of your children. I think I was talking to some of the workers in this area in the hallway today, and it's the same story right across this country. The federal government, through this Colonial Indian Act system, has tried to exercise jurisdiction and authority over the well-being of our children. They've failed. The provinces across this country have, I think, given it their best effort. Out in British Columbia, in Manitoba, I think they've miserably failed. It's obvious, if there is one jurisdiction that our people can take back immediately, you know, I'm talking months. I'm not talking long term. I'm talking child welfare. And each First Nation take over that jurisdiction and match that jurisdiction with the resources to do that job properly. Not downloading, not offloading responsibility, but turning over jurisdiction to a partner nation, the federal crown and the provincial crowns where appropriate, recognizing your authority and working with you, and putting in the interim the same level of resources they're putting into it while we fight for what you determine are the proper level of resources to do that job properly. And after 150 years plus of colonialism, it's going to take a lot more than the standard budget for an average Canadian to do that job properly. And the Assembly of First Nations must stand up with you in designing that your child welfare authority, how you're going to exercise your jurisdiction, and keep Canada's feet to the fire to make sure that it's done properly. If there's any area that we can do that, it's in the area of child welfare. And you have that authority. You know, you've entered into treaties here. Treaties are the basis of your rights, the basis of your relationship with Canada. You've given Canada any legitimacy that they have as a country with your treaties. They need to stand up, live up to, honor those original treaties, and if there's any area they need to start, it's in child welfare.
Thanks, Miles. Sheila, again, in your role as National Chief, how would you support First Nations in Manitoba restore their inherent right over children and families?
Well, first of all, let me establish the reasons why this is very important to take back the jurisdiction of child welfare. Can I ask around the room, has anyone ever had a child or a relative that was apprehended by CFS? Has anyone have relatives that ended up in jail, live in poverty, been affected by missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls? All of it has root causes to what the child welfare industry has done to our kids and our people in this country. It started off in residential school, and way beyond that, it started in colonization. And they've continued, this government, to take our children away because that's where they see our power. That's where they see our legacy and our hope. And they're trying to take that away and trying to contain us by taking our children away. And I know that that's very near and dear to all of us because we all have children and grandchildren and relatives that are precious to us, that are our future, and we want to protect that. In Manitoba, we have one of the most racist provincial governments in Canada, and a lot of it has to do with their attitude towards us as people, and we see that in the child welfare. We have the highest rate of children apprehension in this country, and that's deplorable. We at MKO were penalized when our chiefs tried to stand up against the province, and the Northern Authority was taken back by the province because they didn't think that we were capable of taking our own children, taking care of them. Well, we fought that. As soon as I got in, the Northern Authority was under provincial administration, and I worked hard with my chiefs and our technicians to take back that jurisdiction, and we'll keep doing that because that's where our children have to be under our authority across this country, and that also affects everything else that we just talked about, the incarceration rates. I went to see kids in the Manitoba Youth Centre just a few months ago, and I went to 10 lodges. And out of all of the lodges, there was about 10 kids in each of them, both male and female. There was only 3 non-Indigenous kids. The rest of them were our kids. We have the highest incarceration rates, both adults and youth. And the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, we have the highest in Canada. And all of it is linked to what happens to our children. So I absolutely stand with all of you when you say you want to take back jurisdiction on your children and the child welfare and everything that affects our families. So I stand with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. Perry, how would you, as in your role as National Chief, how would you support First Nations in Manitoba restore their inherent right for jurisdiction over their children?
Again, a very important question. And just listening today, you guys, Chiefs, talked about this earlier on as well, about the need to exert jurisdiction. And I've talked about the need to occupy the field, not only in child welfare, but in other sectors as well. And if you don't want federal law to apply or provincial law, you need to create your own law and occupy the field. And one of the main points we say when we start talking about child welfare legislation, our Assembly of First Nations 10, 12 years ago was the first organization to file the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision. And then Cindy Blackstock came on after again, but it was the AFN that did that, and resulted in 4 binding decisions from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to end discrimination for on-reserve child and family services because they weren't funding our ICFS agencies the same. And so our children weren't getting the same kind of care as they did in the provincial system. And it was clearly proven that it's discrimination. And so that's what we've done so far. But now you've got to fix the on-reserve ICFS agency system, no question, by getting the adequate financial resources and supports there for these young children. Then you also have this provincial system. And that's the challenge. These two systems don't talk. There's no communication. There's no working together. And how did this province come into the thing in the first place? Through Section 88 of the Indian Act. Provincial laws of general application apply. So if there's no federal law on child welfare or First Nations law, then the provinces, kimuts, come in like that. And so you got to get them out and exert your jurisdiction to keep your children at home with their aunties and their uncles and their kokums and their mushums in safe, healthy homes. That's number one. And focus on prevention, not apprehension. Because the existing model, it only kicks in that sunyao, that money, that samba, when you take your kids away and then the money starts pouring in. Well, that's too late. So you got to fix that overall system that's there now. And so you got to fix it, then focus more on prevention, not apprehension. And that takes to work together, reserve by reserve, First Nations by First Nations. But it really is about occupying the field and exerting your jurisdiction. Our children are our most precious resource. Why is there so much alcohol and drugs amongst our people? Why is there so much hurt and pain? It's because of colonization and oppression. We still feel the intergenerational trauma from residential schools, which was genocide of our people. No question. And so we still see that by breakups. People escape that pain, all the abuse from that thing. And so now we've got to get our wellness centers and our detox centers and everything else in place. But our children have to be our big focus going forward. But exert your laws, focus on prevention, not apprehension. Egose.
Thank you. And lastly here to Catherine, as National Chief, how would you restore the inherent right for jurisdiction over children and families in Manitoba?
Thank you, and for this question, I'll take the full 3 minutes. In Manitoba, when we talk about First Nations working to restore their inherent right for jurisdiction over their children and families, this is more than about child welfare. It's about healthy families, and so that we can have healthy communities and we can have healthy nations. We've talked about bringing our children home to our families. We've talked about establishing grandmothers and aunties and grandfathers' councils to direct how that will happen. We've talked about taking back that responsibility because, in essence, we've never given up that responsibility because it's not in our role, it's not in our function as Indigenous peoples, as Ikjawichashta, to ever give up our rights for our children. It's about restoring those responsibilities that have been given to us when we decide to have children. And what does that mean? It means raising them in a loving home. It means providing a home for them. It means ensuring that they learn their language and learn all the lessons that our grandmothers and grandfathers taught. It means providing them with an education, ensuring their education is relevant for them so that they can succeed not only in education but in their life. It means justice and doing the things you need to do so that we don't have to talk about justice, to ensure that our children are raised with those roles and responsibilities we all know we have and that they have. And it means talking about Jordan's principle also. And sadly, that had to be forced, Jordan's principle, to ensure that the children that need our care and help the most are provided with that through a process that has been battled through the Human Rights Tribunal for years now. And children that need our help the most are the ones that are suffering for it and are falling through the gaps. We're not closing that gap. They're falling through it. And we, as parents and grandparents, need to ensure that that happens for our children. And I want to talk about traditional law. And what does that mean? It's in your language. What it means to care for your child. Our children have a right to be loved. They have a right to have a secure future. They have a right to everything that you and I have enjoyed and much more, because a lot of that has been eroded over the years. Healthcare. Our children suffer the most when it comes to healthcare. Education. We put our children through a white middle class education system that is so non-relevant, and then we ask, why the heck aren't they succeeding? Bring those children into our communities and see if they succeed. Of course they're going to. Because they grow up with the knowledge that they are loved and they are special and they are gifted. And then we want to talk about our traditional models. Those are inherent within your upbringing and your ways and in your language. You don't have to create a new model, but there are examples if you want assistance in developing those. So it's about developing and doing what we can to go back to being the healthy people that we were originally put here to be. Thank you.
And thank you, Catherine. We have one final question here before opening it up to the floor. There's a huge economic gap that exists between Canada's First Nation and the non-First Nation population in terms of income, education, and training. This holds especially true for our Northern First Nations, those that are in remote and isolated areas. In your role as National Chief, how would you address this critical issue of the huge economic gap that exists? Miles, do you mind starting us off again?
Again, building our own strong, sustainable economies is one of the key reasons for recognition and affirmation of our rights, our treaty rights, our Aboriginal rights. It's absolutely essential. We need to take over jurisdiction over child welfare, over our family units. We need to set up our own laws and resource them equally and fairly. But that is not going to be enough in and of itself. We also need strong, sustainable economies in our nations to ensure our self-sufficiency, to ensure our being in charge of our destiny. If the last 150 years of disentitlement and oppression of our rights has shown anything to us, it's demonstrated that poverty sucks. Poverty is no way to build a nation. Poverty is no way to have a healthy, functional family unit. And we've got to stand up together first and insist that the Government of Canada partner with us on their fundamental commitments that they made to you people in enacting Treaty 1, that the federal Crown was going to establish a relationship, a partnership with you, in you coming down that river of life side by side in a healthy way with the people of Canada. We've got to stand together and make sure that when the natural resources of our territories are talked about, that we are in the room, that we're an equal part of the conversation. And how are we going to do that? We're going to do that by standing up together as nations. You know, we didn't just come into to our territories today. We're all proud, self-sufficient nations who have existed in our territories for millennia. We need to come together again, recognize that, and insist on our fair share of our economies, of our resource revenues, and of taxations, which is how governments operate. And we need to stand up and insist that Canada be a partner with us in that endeavor. I've spent the last 3 years of my life at the University of Victoria, my alma mater, being director of an initiative called the National Consortium for Indigenous Economic Development, working with First Nations, other governments, and industry to shore up Indigenous economic development across this country. We can do this. We need to focus on it. And the AFN needs to provide leadership for building these strong, sustainable economies.
Thank you, Miles. Sheila, as National Chief, how would you address the huge economic gap that exists?
I'm from Bunbonabee Cree Nation, as I say, and I know what it's like to live in a remote community and to come from a remote community and to try and make a go of life in this city. It's very hard. It's not an easy task. And I know that each and every one of you, especially from the north, know people that have, that have tried and that have fallen into the gaps and into trouble for not being able to transition into the city properly. Because I think at the end of the day, when we really think about it, all our families really want is to be healthy, to have jobs that they can buy their own things, that they can travel wherever they want to. And those dreams are often not affordable to our Northern Manitoba First Nations and Northern Canada First Nations. And even in the communities that have roads, this is a very limited possibility. That's one of the reasons why a few years ago, in my second year as the MKO Grand Chief, I introduced an Economic Development Action Plan. And in that plan, we talked about looking at how many jobs there are in Northern Manitoba. And right now, that work is being done by Brandon University and others to see what that is, because it is a myth that there are no jobs in Northern Manitoba. But there are jobs. We just need post-secondary education to do those jobs. So there is opportunity, but at the same time, we know that education is not meeting the needs of what our people need to take these jobs. And sometimes even barriers as getting a driver's license and getting ID is not helpful. And we're hearing this across the country. In Northern Ontario, they call it the remote quotient. And oftentimes, governments, when they're making decisions about our communities, they don't factor in how much more it costs to send food and to send resources to our remote communities and our northern communities. And that has to change. That has to be brought to that level where governments understand that, $50,000 is not enough to maintain roads, for example, in God's Lake Narrows. I believe that in some of our communities, that's what they get. And meanwhile, it costs $2 million to just maintain a little bit of, the roads all year long. And that's simply not enough. It's not fair. And I know what it's like to live in a remote community. And that's one of the reasons I also am deciding to put my name in to represent the North that is often forgotten by governments and also the AFN. They don't factor the extra added pressure and intensity that comes, when we live in the North. And poverty creates trauma. I always tell the public, don't tell our kids to get a job or an education if you're not going to help provide a good education and if you're not going to help them provide a way for them to get these jobs. In Winnipeg alone, we have a huge population of our kids, of our Indigenous people, and we don't see them in these entry-level jobs. It's because of all of the things that they face. So I will fight for and stand with our northern and remote communities, always.
And thank you, Sheila. Perry, as National Chief, how would you address the economic gap?
Yep. That was in the North. So 6 or 7 points, Chiefs, to relate to the question. If we start talking about self-determination, self-government, ultimately it's linked to economic self-sufficiency. That's point number 1. But in the North, federally now, all federal funding arrangements should have a northern quotient factor or a northern remoteness factor put into that funding relationship, which means advocating for that policy change in Ottawa. So that's got to be there in all the funding relationships at the Ottawa level, even at the RDGs here. So there's got to be a new fiscal relationship, new fiscal policy that takes into consideration the cost of doing business in the North. Greater costs for everything, from housing to food to everything else. So that's on the federal side. So all existing funding relationships or any new monies have to have that northern factor quotient. We've got to push for that. Number 3, legal challenge on the NRTA. We've talked about it for 30 years now. If we do the legal challenge, that'll be a push factor on Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta. The legal challenge. Then those provincial governments will come to the tables. Because we always focus on the feds all the time. You got to also have a strategy provincial-wise here. And that's that legal fight, that legal push to challenge the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement as unfinished treaty business. We only share the depth of a plow. So we got to legally challenge that. So that's step number 3. Number 4, access to capital. Biggest hurdles to economic development is access to capital, not enough money, not enough capacity building. So making sure that there's access to capital in the North so you have those resources when you have those business development opportunities that come up. Number 5, provincial policy change. Who issues licenses and permits to industry to go develop all the resource wealth in the North or in the South or anywhere? It's the provincial government. So you lobby this premier here and the ministers in this Manitoba area that before they issue a license or permit to any industry to go take the trees, go take the fish, go take the oil, the coal, the gas, uranium, or whatever there is, that company better have a relationship with First Nations people. And that company better have a strategy on revenue sharing, employment, jobs for First Nations people on their board of directors. I'll call it a First Nation strategy partnership. And if they don't, the provincial government should not issue a license or permit to any private sector industry operating Manitoba boundaries. And that's a push and fight that you can do provincial-wise. The other thing, I had policing as essential services in the North. All over, not just in the North, but everywhere, policing as essential services. So economic development in the North is very important. The last point I had, within the Assembly of First Nations, we did establish a Northern portfolio. Remember, we have 10 regional chiefs. Yukon, Northwest Territories, we have a regional chief that's responsible for Northern issues. And that's what we've got to give it teeth, give it energy to make sure that breathes life into that. And that's what we're going to keep doing going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Catherine, as National Chief, how would you work to address the economic gap?
going directly to the question of addressing economic gap that exists between First Nations and non-First Nations as it relates to income, training, and for our northern First Nations remote and isolated areas. How do we address this? How do we address the actual fact that our children in the north and our families in the north don't have access to the services that we have access to in the south? First of all, we need to know what those are, and I'm going to go back to a process that we engaged in my home community when we were going through this process, where community planning was done. A comprehensive 10-year plan was developed for how we were going to address our youth, what kind of jobs did we, and doing an HR plan also. How many children do we have? How old are they going to be in 5 years and 10 years' time? What are we going to need for them in education, in health, in jobs, in economic development opportunities, in all those areas that our children deserve services? How are we going to address that? And what are we going to do to address that? Engage in partnerships with your fellow people, with your fellow tribal councils. Engage in partnerships in green energy, just as Fisher River did. And congratulations again on your solar farm. That is a wonderful example of what can be done. Engage in partnerships, for example, Clear Sky Connections, and what you're doing with fiber optic technology is here, and we have to utilize it, not only for the benefit of our children education, but for the benefit of health. It's critical for health needs, especially in the north and remote communities. Those are partnerships you can engage in. And then I go back to many, many resolutions that have been passed in this Assembly and in National Assembly about working together to support each other so we don't have to depend on outside sources. About the old way of trading goods, about the old way of engaging in relationships to support each other for the needs that you have in your communities. You have something I don't have. I'm going to partner with you to get that. And I will do what's commonly called Indian trading. It's the best way to do trading. It was the original way. And those are relationships that we inherently have always had. And we've set them aside because we're dependent upon the almighty dollar to get things done to feed our children. That's not necessary. You have to do those things. It's about my relationship with you and your relationship with me. And how are we going to make that work to benefit your community, your people, and your nation? And I got 28 seconds. When you looked at the video this morning, I recall attending a meeting where that executive council met in the MIB days. I'm not that old, but I remember it. And the Grand Chief of the day, David Kershane, at that time told the Prime Minister, Senior Trudeau, all you have to do is give us what is rightfully ours, a percentage of the natural resources of this country, and we will never come to your door for $1 again. You have to follow up on that. You have to do something about that, because that is indeed the answer. Thank you.
And Catherine, thank you. We have about a half hour left still, and we want to provide each of the candidates with another 3 minutes for a closing. So we will open it up now to the floor. If any of the chiefs out there have some questions, perhaps if you could just introduce yourself and direct the question to all or any of the candidates.
Microphone 7. Tell them
Microphone 7.
Good evening, and good luck to all of you. My name is Chris Baker, Chief of the Yopi-Punipewin Cree Nation. I have one question that will relate to the other in relation to the other three that were spoken on and asked. It seems like these days that, and I don't mean no disrespect, but the AFN is sort of following the agenda of Canada and the current government. And how would you change that? But the AFN to be more accountable to we as First Nation communities and chiefs and leadership here in Manitoba. The other is, that's one question. The other would be, we talk about, and I hear all of you say that we should be going after the 1930 Natural Resource Transfers Act that would give us the ability to become and form our own government and our own sustainability. In order for that to occur, what steps and what plans would you have in order to create that nation-to-nation government that Canada would have to recognize, and the province of Manitoba would have to adhere to that government that you speak on, or that we all want? We all know that we have treaty rights. As chiefs, we have that right to govern our individual nations. But as a collective that you're speaking on, such as the Assembly of First Nations, what are your plans or your steps in order to achieve that self-government, inherent right, and treaty rights that you speak on? I'd like to hear a little dialogue or something like that, an action plan. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief. Miles, we've been starting with you. I'll just remind you of what the Chief's question was briefly. Just the AFN appears to be following the agenda of Canada and the federal government. How would you change that to be more accountable to First Nations here in Manitoba? And what steps and plans would you take to create, to achieve self-government, a nation-to-nation?
I think, thank you for the question. I think that's very clear. I believe in one reason that I'm running today is because I believe that we as First Nations, and the AFN is certainly a big part of that, primarily react to the federal government. Issues that come down are defined by their agenda, by their ministers, by their cabinet table. Why I'm running and why I want to ask for your vote is I believe our power rests in recognizing ourselves as Indigenous people, as we've always been. You know who you are. I know who I am. We need to recognize each other first. And then we need to figure out what we hold in common. That takes leadership to identify our common agenda. And then we need to stand up together and assert that and ensure that Canada lives up to its promise of partnership with First Nations. That was the original promise that led to treaty making in this country. That's what they forgot when they enacted the Parliament of Canada and put in the Indian Act over 150 years ago. We've got to stand up and not let that happen. And in asserting treaty rights, in asserting Aboriginal rights, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I would provide leadership for. 30 years ago, my people put that same challenge to us as the young leaders of my nation. We built our own modern government, our own modern constitution for the Haida Nation. We passed laws through that constitution about how our lands and waters would be regulated. Today, Canada and BC in their areas of Crown jurisdiction have matched our jurisdictions. They couldn't fight us. They couldn't stand up to the truth. They had to match our jurisdictions. Now we need to embed that not only in the laws of the Haida Nation and the Treaty 1 nations, we need to embed that in the laws of Canada and the laws of the provinces. And we do that by building on the long string of court victories who've affirmed our position, the position of our elders. We do that by standing up together and asserting our laws when we make them, building strong governments within each of our nations, and standing up and asserting those together. That's really easy to say. That is tough to do. I've spent my life doing that on the West Coast with the Haida Nation in the northwest of BC and amongst the BC nations. I know we can do that nationally. We need to stand shoulder to shoulder and rely on each other. The most important nation-to-nation relationships are amongst ourselves.
Thanks, Miles. And Sheila, again, the question that it appears the AFN is following the agenda of Canada and the federal government. How would you be more accountable to First Nations in Manitoba? And how would you achieve self-government that the federal and provincial governments would adhere to?
Chiefs, councils, of course, our citizens. what I've seen in the last 3 years, observing closer to what AFN's process is, I know that we need changes. We know that AFN was designed in a certain way 30 years ago when it was established, but it's evolving. We have changed as a nation, and we have changed as chiefs and leaders, and we have to change with the times. And I think the way that the AFN makes decisions and operates is starting to not represent what our communities are needing. And when we talk about accountability, it seems like this AFN is much more accountable to the government more than it is to us. They're patting themselves on the back for ending one boil water advisory at a time, and AFN is helping them with doing that. When we see a government that spent $4.5 billion on Kinder Morgan, when they had that money, they could have ended all of the boil water advisories across Canada. So we're not seeing an AFN that is holding the government's feet to the fire, and we need to do that. We know that the only way we can do that is if we empower our nations and our communities to be there and talk about the solutions that matter to them and the ones that really work. So we have to transform AFN. I know that the current process is that regional chiefs have national portfolios, but how is that working? I know that Kevin, our regional chief, works really hard at the portfolios that he has, but really, we should really look at how our regional chiefs are operating in our provinces. I'm hearing from different regions that it's not effective, that we need to keep our regional chiefs closer to home so they can understand and be able to represent your needs at the national level and know their communities inside and out, not running, looking at nationally big portfolios that technicians can handle. So I know that there is a lot of need and a lot of movement now for AFN to transform, and even the way resolutions are done. I know how resolutions work because we do that too at MKO, and we do that here at AMC. Resolutions usually pass on the third day, and sometimes they barely pass. And then who holds the national chief or the grand chiefs accountable to make sure these resolutions are being passed or that are being carried out? There is no recourse for national chief or any grand chief to make sure that mandates are carried out. And we have to change that process so that we have a better system to represent what our communities are asking us to do, but ultimately what our sovereign nations are heading to, because that's where we're evolving to. And, we have to look at equal representation, and that's part of transforming AFN, and also push for the treaty-based funding. I know that there is a lot of good efforts in trying to take our hands and our caps in hand to the government. That's not where our power is. Our power is within our nations, and we have to take that power and control back for our communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. And Perry, again, it appears the AFN's following the agenda of Canada and the federal government, and how do you create that nation-to-nation achieve self-government?
Got it. Good question, Chief. And our Assembly of First Nation is an advocate organization. That's all we are. 2015, before the federal government election, 2015, get that document, Closing the Gap document. That's what we used. That's what we used to advocate and lobby for policy and legislative change. That Closing the Gap document, we took it to the Liberals, lobbied them. Took it to Conservatives, lobbied them. Took it to the NDP, lobbied them. Into the Green Party. Because we said, if there's an election coming up and you want Indians to vote for you, you better put our priorities and our issues front and center on your party policy platform. That's what we lobbied for. That's what we advocated for. And that was our agenda. Because everything in that Closing the Gap document was done by National Chiefs resolutions in our AFN. That's where they came from. So that's our agenda. It's not government agenda. We lobbied based on Chiefs and Assembly direction. And that's our mandate, and that's what we get. That's what we listen to. We're guided by that. And so that's what happened in 2015. And prior to 2015, we had the Conservative government. How was that working for Indians? Not very good. That's what I remember, because we didn't have access to the Prime Minister at all. I had one meeting. And so now we have access to the decision makers. We have access to the ministers. And we better take advantage, because you don't know what's going to happen in 2019. You don't know. So if our job is to advocate, then we better advocate and lobby for policy and legislative change and everything we need to now. Because that's where these missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry came from. Lobbying and supporting the families. That's where the TRC commitment for implementing all the TRC calls to action, all 94, including the UN Declaration. That's where the 2% funding cap was supposed to be lifted, and that's where the $17 billion comes from. It's advocating and lobbying, because you've got to get more money, and that pie has to be bigger nationally, so these ministers can get it out to the chiefs across Canada. And that's where the commitment for law and policy review came from as well. So it's advocating, and it's based on that Closing the Gap document. That's that piece. The inherent right to self-government, Chief, it's up to you and your community. Because I applied to Little Black Bear. The creators on top, then the people. They elect the chief and council at LBB. Then belong to an agency, then a tribal council, then the FSIN, then the AFN. The AFN's on the bottom. That's what we belong to. But then Little Black Bear signed Treaty 4. Entered into treaty. He didn't sign it. He entered into Treaty 4, and he put his 4 direction mark on that treaty. And that sanctity of contract, that sacredness. And we're part of the Cree Nation, the Cree Assiniboine. So on this side are the constants. So that's why I'm big on treaty areas coming together. Break down provincial boundaries. That's our way out of the Indian Act. But that's treaty implementation and treaty enforcement. And so when we talk about self-determination, it's going to be up to how you and your people decide. But we have collective rights, inherent rights, and we have treaty rights. Break down provincial boundaries, and let's rebuild this thing together in a good way.
Thank you, Perry. And Catherine, again, the question is the AFN following the agenda of the Canadian and federal government, how could they change that and be more accountable here in Manitoba? And how would you create that nation-to-nation that provincial and federal governments would adhere to?
Thank you for that recap. Thank you very much, Chief Baker. I appreciate the question because it is a question we deal with every day in our daily lives, regardless of where we live and regardless of where we are. When we talk about nation-to-nationhood, first of all, what does that mean to you? When you talk about sovereignty, what does that mean to you? When we talk about, we title our communities as a nation, but yet you are already a part of a larger collective. The Cree Nation is huge. The Anishinaabe Nation is huge. The Dakota Nation is huge. And it crosses provincial boundaries, and it crosses, in fact, international boundaries. I, for one, do not recognize the boundaries that separate me from my relatives across this country and across what was commonly called the Medicine Line, where my relatives live stateside. Those are my family, and that is our nation. It's not just one community. So first of all, we have to have an understanding about what do we mean by nation? And what do we mean by sovereignty? You're sovereign unto yourself as a community, but what about the rest of your extended family that are beyond your boundaries? And what about the rest of your Cree family across the country? That is true nation to nation, and that is true sovereignty. And that requires you as leadership to determine that. What exactly that relationship is. And you also have treaty relationships and treaty boundaries. And you have to give life to that. Now, you asked for a step-by-step approach on how to do that. Well, first of all, you have to decide what it is you want and where it is you want to go in order for somebody to do that policy advocacy and that review that needs to happen. Because you know what? It's going to involve a lot of money if you're going to start talking about analyzing the legal context to have recommendations provided to you for how you're going to move forward in addressing your nationhood stance that you're going to take. Because if we continue on the path we're continuing on, all we are behaving is as municipalities. And we know that. We are a nation. Now you have to assert that. And you have to embrace it, and you have to practice it, and you have to live it and breathe it. And it's much more than going to your regional director general for money. It's much more than meeting the minister to say, I want this and I want that, and I congratulate those of you who have been able to get what you need for your people through those processes. But when you're talking true nation to nation, you have rights for your land, your water, all your natural resources, your original title. You go to the Supreme Court decisions, although we utilize those as tools, but that's not what determines where we go as a people. What determines where we go as a people is how we decide as a collective, like you said. And I know where we're going as a nation because I sit with the elders and because the knowledge holders are the ones who advise us and tell us. You listened to Elder Bone this morning tell you what you needed to do. You listened to his report that all the elders compiled on your behalf because you asked him to. Your answers lie with those elders and those knowledge holders. The legal context can be done by those who have that training, but the knowledge still comes from you who speak your language and your elders to determine what that means at nation. I know what my relationship with you is, Chief Baker. And I know what my relationship is with you too, and with anyone that is in this room, because it was taught to me as on a personal level and as well. Oh my goodness. I could talk about this all day because I live it and I breathe it. And I believe in nationhood and I believe in sovereignty. But you have to understand it for yourself and do something. And we will help you. Because it really requires a lot of legal work and policy work. But why do you want to listen to a government that's not your government? Why do you want to listen to Canada? Why do you want to listen to Manitoba? You have to listen to your people and develop that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. We were trying to go an hour and a half, so I think we'll go to closing comments, right? Yes, okay. And I've also been asked to change up the who we go to first here this time, so maybe we'll start with the incumbent. And Perry, if you wouldn't mind providing us with your 3 minutes of closing comments. Thank you.
All right, closing comments. Again, thanks to all my fellow candidates, and we're missing one. Russell will be there next week. For me, Chiefs, again, I've been on council at Little Black Bear. I've been a chief at Little Black Bear. I know what you go through. I've been a tribal council chief. I've been a regional chief, a Treaty 4 representative, and now national chief. And in the last 4 years, we tried to get some momentum going in certain areas. And some of the things that we focused on were based on that Closing the Gap document. So to me, when you take a position, no matter where you are, you're trying to get something done. And you're trying to leave that place a little better than when you came into it. And I believe so far I've done that as your incumbent national chief. We've got things moving, but we're not done yet. We haven't finished our Indigenous Languages Act yet. And that's so vital to our sovereignty and our nationhood is our languages. And we don't want the residential schools to win, which is the genocide and the killing of our languages. So we want to revitalize our Indigenous languages. So our children are going to be proud of being Denisontle, Anishinaabe, Nehewak peoples, or Dakota peoples. That's a focus. So we're trying to get that Languages Act done. Then we also want this child welfare piece fixed, federally and provincially. So we started that work going forward. We need to get that work done. We also said we got to move beyond the Indian Act. That's the biggest thing. So that's where respect to implement our treaties and our inherent rights and move beyond those 4 crazy policies, comp claims, spec claims, ATR, inherent right. We've got process, but we've got to fix those things and make sure that they're First Nations driven. And then the big one, this fiscal relationship with the Crown. We have a little low-hanging fruit is what I call it, where you can carry over from one fiscal year to the next. That's from the work from our Chiefs Committee on Fiscal Table. And then as well, the 10-year grants aren't for everybody, but we're trying to work towards nation to nation. Some First Nations can use it to leverage, so it works for some. It's not for everybody. So low-hanging fruit from the Chiefs Committee work on fiscal. We have all Chiefs Committees on education, on language, but there's 3 new committees we created last year. One on gaming, one on nation building, and one on cross-border crossing. So Chiefs Committees, that's how we function now in the AFN. We also have a work plan to fix our AFN charter. Our AFN charter is outdated. It hasn't been changed in 20 plus years. So we budgeted some financial and human resources to go out to fix it. So we can look at treaty area representatives. So we can have more voices for our chiefs committees. Make sure our hereditary chiefs and our clan mothers have a voice. And even look at rep by pop. There's all these things that have to happen. So we have the work plan. We've got the momentum. It'd be my honor and privilege to serve as a Noskapayos, as a servant or helper of the people again. Next July 25, next Wednesday, I'm going to ask for your help and support again. It'd be my privilege and honor to serve my 2nd term as your national chief. Egose, kanaskum tinuang.
Thank you, sir. Catherine, would you mind coming up and providing your closing comments for us?
Thank you very much, Chiefs, for your patience and for the for our First Nation citizens that have joined us and remain in the room, and also for our elders that continue to sit with us and listen to us. And for my closing comments, I want to, first of all, offer up that this path that I am on right now is based on long-term vision, long-term teachings, and listening to those people who have that knowledge of what was before my time, what they foresaw that was coming, and what they are pleading with us to do so that our children will have a future. You know me. I've been at this table with you as a chief and as a council member. I've been at this table with you as your regional chief. And I've sat here many, many times as your executive director and as well as your chairperson. I understand your issues. I've dealt with your thousands of resolutions. I've dealt with the many times you threw papers on the floor because I didn't see you when you were waving your hands, Chief McDougall. And I've also dealt with the beautiful things that have happened in this room and been a part of it, and I've witnessed it. And I know you have the wherewithal to make life better for our children. Because if that's not what you're here for, then you shouldn't be here. Because that is something that our elders and our grandmothers and our grandfathers, our knowledge holders, tell us. And I want to share with you, and I've used this statement before many times, my late dear mother, when she asked us not to have any more children, her family. And no grandmother ever says that. When she asked us, she said, please don't have any more children. And she said, because this world is a wicked place, and it's no place to raise children. And unless you can guarantee that your children are going to be healthy, and they're going to be happy, and they're going to have a good life, please don't have children. That's the reason why I'm standing here. And that's the reason why I've done everything I've done since my children were born. And that's the reason why I follow the teachings of my grandmother and my great-grandmother, and why I listen to the elders that sit in the room, and why I listen to you, and why I share the things that I share. It's because I love our people, I love our children, and I love who we are, and I have faith and belief that we will do what's right for our children, and we will do what's right for the future of our people, because that's all we have. We have nothing else if we don't provide that hope for our young people, and if we don't provide that hope for our children. That's why I'm here. I can talk policy with you, I can talk legislation with you, and I can talk politics with you. But that's not the answer. You look in here, and you listen to your heart and your spirit, and you'll listen to your grandmothers. Wopida mitake was.
Thank you, Catherine. Miles, would you mind providing us with your closing comments?
Thank you, moderator. First of all, I want to also thank the other candidates for letting their name stand. Perry has served as national chief. You know, I'm not running because I'm mad at Perry or don't like Perry. I think we're all want, as Catherine just said, a better world for future generations. And Catherine and Sheila and Russell have really added important elements to this essential discussion amongst our people at a critical moment in time. So I really feel proud to have been part of this debate, and it's going to come to a conclusion next week in Vancouver, and I'm asking all of you to listen to the messages and vote for Miles Richardson for National Chief. I don't want to go into a long summary. Go to my website, milesrichardson.ca. You can see my platform and some of the details of what I've been talking about. But when I look across this country and see, what I see is Indigenous nations who are the living generations of proud, strong, ancient nations that have been in this country now called Canada for hundreds of generations. And I see that we're going through a tough time. Each of us are. You know, the last 300 years, mainly the last 150 years, have been really tough on our people. And I see we're at a crossroads. I can really clearly see we're at a crossroads. We have a choice of trying to fix the path we're on, which is a colonial Indian Act authorized path. Or we can make a new choice. We can choose to be who we know we are. The choice our people have always made that let us be strong today. I believe really strongly that trying to fix the colonial Indian Act path, they could put 20, 30 million, billion dollars a year into that. It's a dead-end street for our people. I believe we need to stand up together as nations and be who we are. Help each other rebuild our governments, our constitutions. Help each other to close the social gaps, to the water issues, the women and children issues, the language issues, the education issues, the health issues, and build strong economies by standing up and insisting that Canada recognize and respect our treaty rights, recognize and respect our Aboriginal rights, which puts us on the path to being self-determining, to be in charge of our own fate as peoples and look after our own children and future generations. Hawa, thank you for welcoming me here, and we'll see you all next week in Vancouver.
Thank you, Miles. Last but certainly not least, we have Sheila North.
I want to thank each and every one of you for your time and for your also your help in the last 3 years as your MKO Grand Chief. I'm not going to be seeking re-election. I've made that decision because of my commitments to running for this position. And I can only stand confidently to run for this position because of all of you that I have come to consider as friends and colleagues in Manitoba. I can't do this national run without all of you, each and every one of you, all of your councils and even your elders and your children and youth, because you're the ones who taught me how to be a leader. My father did, and my mother did, and my community did, my elders did. I got a call from an elder today telling me, this is the right path for our people. This is a movement. This is more than just an election. This is a way for our people to move away from the colonization and to move away from begging governments to give us a handout. We're tired of that, and that's what I'm hearing across this country. In my track record, in the short time I was able to be the Grand Chief at MKO, and I thank you again for that, I was able to look at the 30 years of resolutions, and one of the common themes that was that we have to change the health of our people. And I pursued Minister Philpott. Every single time I saw her, I said, we need a new way for health. We have to take back control of our health, and we have made concrete steps to do that in the health transformation work we're doing at MKO. One of the other things that our leaders told me to do was do something about our young people. I've brought in teams to come and motivate our young people, live different, and other initiatives. And also the MMIW. I've been one of the strongest advocates as a journalist, but also as a communications person and also as a Grand Chief of this issue. You saw me hold the Chief Commissioner to account for not listening to our people, and I'll continue to do that on all the issues, especially when it comes to our women and children. Our Languages Act, I support that. Perry did a good thing by supporting that, and I will support that going forward as well. And you look at our pamphlets there, you'll see what I mean about obligations met. We have to go beyond Section 35. Opportunities created and opinions matter. So I would work towards making sure that our communities are better represented at the national level. And I want to thank all of you veteran leaders that have taught us younger leaders the way, and I acknowledge you, and I follow your path, and I humbly ask each and every one of you to consider me as your national chief, because I didn't come here by myself. I came here with you. I'm at this level, and when I'm hearing across the country is they like what we're doing in Manitoba. Despite all our challenges, we find ways to come together, and we unite, and we become strong, and that's what I want to continue, and I hope that I will be your next national chief, and I thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you to all of the candidates for joining us and all of you out there who were here for this. We look forward to seeing you all next week as APTN National News will be on the floor of the AFN AGA all week in Vancouver. And just for closing comments, we're going to turn it back over to Grand Chief Dumas.
Thank you, yeah. Thanks. I'm getting to know you real well.
Thanks for coming. So, Chiefs, just in closing, I want to give thanks to all the candidates. I also want to send my best regards to candidate Rusty Abo, who's dealing with an urgent family emergency. And I also want to encourage all the chiefs, if you're not going to Vancouver next year, please find next week, find a proxy so that we can send a strong delegation. And a little bit of a warning. Manitoba knows what's good for Manitoba, and whoever the Grand Chief is going to be next week, make sure you listen, and we'll tell you the path we need for our own region. So let's give them all another round of applause.